You can split that into 2 or 3 subjects itself. This one here, Daniel chapter 11, we're covering over 2,000 years of history in one chapter. And so I would need a week to be able to actually go through it with you properly, each verse, precept upon precept. So what we're doing is free study materials have been offered, and so I haven't printed it because my study material is 40 pages. So I won't print it unless you request it. Otherwise, it's just too much paper to print. So what I will be presenting, I'm taking it for granted that you know it. I know that you don't exactly, and that's why I'm offering you the study material, so that whatever I present is backed up by history. It's backed up by works, secular works that I've studied. I've put hours and hours into this, and I still haven't exhausted it. I haven't even tipped the iceberg. But we're going to go through it. Now, Daniel is a beautiful character in the Bible. In chapter 10 is really where you begin. Chapter 10, 11, and 12 is basically one experience. It's one scene. In chapter 10, Daniel prays for 3 weeks. He fasts. He begins to fast and to pray for 3 weeks, wanting to know and understand more about the visions that we've studied about before, and especially in Daniel chapter 8, chapter 9. He wants God to reveal more to him. He has some understanding, but he wants to know more and more. And he prays for 3 weeks. And at the end of the 3 weeks, Gabriel comes to him. And he says, I'm going to make you understand. I'm going to fulfill your answer. I'm going to answer your prayer. God has heard you. You are beloved. And now I'm going to expand to you what the scriptures say about what is to come. Now, I'm not going to focus too much on the first part of Daniel 11 because a lot of it has come out in Daniel chapter 8 yesterday. So I'm only going to summarize. What I've done is in my mind, I've broken up the chapter into multiple categories. That makes it easier for me, and I hope for you, to understand. The first section would be the greats falling. And I say the greats in quotations because in the first 4 verses of Daniel chapter 11, you see Cyrus the Great, you see Darius the Great, and you see Alexander the Great. All come out in the first 4 verses of Daniel chapter 11. Now, just to read it, just so you can understand, Daniel chapter 11, verses 1 to 4. Also I, in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I stood to confirm and to strengthen him. The angel is talking here. And now will I show thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than they all. And by his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Grecia. And a mighty king shall stand up, that shall rule with great dominion, and do according to his will. And when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken, and shall be divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, and not to his posterity, not according to his dominion which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up, even for others beside those. Now what we find here is first reference. I'm going to put a bit of focus on this first part because if we know where the starting point is, then we can follow along. Would you agree? If you know where to start from, you can follow the verses. But if you don't have a starting point, you're going to get lost in the whole chapter as far as this chapter when it talks about then kings of the north and kings of the south, you'll be lost. If we know where we start from, then we know that we have where we can continue. We can follow the line of history step by step. Now, the first part, he mentions about 3 kings, right, would stand up after. Now, he's talking about 3 kings after Cyrus the Great. And so let's just look at what these 3 kings were. First one was Cambyses, the son of Cyrus, ruled until 522 BC. Now, Smerdis ruled for only 8 months. This man was thought to be an impostor. And so actually Darius the Great, the third king, had him murdered because he believed that he was an imposter, and he got all the realm, I guess, fired up against him. And so then after him, Darius the Great became king. And then after these three kings, you're going to find one that's far richer than they all. And this fourth king that came after was Xerxes the first, or otherwise known as Xerxes the Great, reigned as Persian king 486 to 465 BC. And he was in fact far richer than they all, as actually mentioned in the book of Esther. In the book of Esther, you find reference to this Xerxes, except the Hebrew terms him Ahasuerus, because that's the Hebrew name for Xerxes. And you'll see that here. And just to show his wealth, now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, which reigned from India even unto Ethiopia, even 127 provinces. This is what Brother Peter was talking about yesterday, that this kingdom was great. He was hitting the peak of the Persian kingdom. It says that in those days when the king Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan the palace, in the 3rd year of his reign he made a feast unto all his princes and his servants, the power of Persia and Media, the nobles and princes of the provinces being before him, when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and honor of his excellent majesty many days, even 180 days, or 180 days. He had this feast, and he was showing the greatness of his riches and his power. This was that fourth king that the angel was telling Daniel will rise up, and he will be far richer than they all. Right? And by the strength of his riches, he will stir up. And this Xerxes actually wanted to compete with Grecia. Grecia was becoming a threat. And so there was actually some wars happening in the time of Xerxes up until you had this mighty king, which Daniel verse 3 of 11 mentioned. And that mighty king was Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great came up, and it says that he would rule with a great dominion. He added to the Persian kingdom Greece and Macedonia, right? And that became a great kingdom. And it says that he did according to his will. So I'm not going too much into it because Brother Peter touched on this already. But he was ruler of the then known world before he was 30. Before he was even 30, ruler of the then known world. With such fast and quick succession, he just conquered one province after the other. And yet he conquered all of that, but the Bible says that he did according to his will. Alexander the Great was really actually a vile man, and he couldn't even control himself. At the snap of a finger, he would have his own friends murdered, his own friends, not enemies, his own friends, while he was drunk. And just plunder cities and just do all sorts of things. The Bible says in Proverbs that greater is he who can control himself than he who can take a city. And this man, Alexander the Great, couldn't even control himself, yet he took many cities. And it shows who is wise in the sight of God. Who is wise and who is great. Now, from Alexander, he died, and there was no inheritance went to his family. Actually, his whole family were murdered soon after, and then there was this big fight with multiple generals. I think even over 100 generals were fighting for territory. And finally, it all boiled down to four. 4 generals consented to split the kingdom up. So you have Ptolemy, that's up there. Ptolemy the first, he was ruler of Egypt, Libya, Arabia, Colossus, Syria, and Palestine, which was known as Kingdom of the South. Cassander was Macedonia and Greece, Lysimachus, Thrace, Bithynia, and other provinces beyond Hellespont. And Seleucus was the rest of Asia to the other side of Euphrates, as far as the Indus, going all the way to India. Pretty much Syria and Babylon was Seleucus. And Seleucus had the main territory, was the bulk of it. Now, what happened is, as we get into Daniel 11 verse 5, now we have the picture that the kingdom starts with these 4 generals. Now, what is north and what is south? How do we know what's north and south? Where do we make the point? Well, coming from Daniel's perspective, the central figure is Jerusalem. It's Palestine. That's the middle mark. And it's from that mark that you either say north or you say south or east or west, that you know what is north and that you know what is south. So from Palestine, north would be Syria, going up to Greece or Thrace or Asia Minor, and going south would be Egypt. Okay, the point, this is an important point, the point is from Palestine, from Jerusalem. And it talks about these 4 winds. The kingdom would be split up into 4 winds, and this is what you find. Ptolemy became the king of the south. King of the south because south from Jerusalem. Lysimachus, king of the north, because he ruled Thrace, which include Asia Minor. Cassander, west, because he ruled Greece and the adjacent countries there. And Seleucus was king of the east because he ruled Syria and Babylon. Now, what happened in history is that Lysimachus, the ruler of Asia Minor there, conquered Cassander. So he joined in, he annexed Greece in that one kingdom. After him, Seleucus conquered Lysimachus. So Seleucus ended up with 3 parts of the whole Grecian Empire. Seleucus ended up with the 3 parts, with Lysimachus' part and Cassander's part. So in prophecy, Seleucus became the king of the north. Is that understood? Does that make sense? What's important to also understand is that, we'll get there with this statement. Okay, during the wars and revolutions which for long ages succeeded, these geographical boundaries were frequently changed and or obliterated. Old ones were wiped out and new ones instituted. But whatever changes might occur, these first divisions of the empire must determine the names which these portions of territory should ever afterward bear, or we have no standard by which to test the application of the prophecy. So the territory has to always remain the same, and it's whoever occupies that territory that we know who is that king. Okay, so just to clarify, that is, whatever power at any time should occupy the territory which at first constituted the kingdom of the north, that power, so long as it occupied that territory, would be the king of the north. Do you understand that? So Seleucus was king of the north because he ruled Asia Minor. Okay, he ruled that. But if the moment someone else conquers Seleucus, what happens? That person or that power becomes now the king of the north. Is that understood? Okay, and same with the other way. Whatever power should occupy that which at first constituted the kingdom of the south or Egypt, that power would also be the king of the south. Okay, so now in the following passages, when you read from verses 5 to 14 of Daniel, there is constant civil warfare. Pretty much the portion of verses 5 to 14 is what you would call the Ptolemies versus the Seleucids. These were 2 Grecian dynasties, one ruling Egypt and one ruling Asia Minor and Babylon and Syria and all that area. And these 2, they were never content to remain with the territory that they had. They were always fighting, and it was going back and forth, back and forth. And actually, some of the characteristics as you read, and like I said, we simply don't have the time to go through it. But if you'd like to study it further, all you need to do is ask, and someone can visit you and study with you in detail, because that's what it really deserves. But in short, you'll see these characteristics that come out in those portions of verses where you got Ptolemies, and like you had the 2 first kings, right? And what happened is their prosperity. So their children would fight, and then those children would fight, and then those children would fight. Sometimes the Egyptians would win, sometimes the Seleucids would win from the north, and it was back and forth. And And there was treachery, right? There was sometimes, to try and make peace, they would try and marry off a daughter to one of the kings to try and make peace, and it would never work. There was constant murder and envy and hatred, covetousness, pride, arrogancy. You just see it come out so much in the history. When I was reading this, I thought to myself, who needs to watch daytime television like The Bold and the Beautiful? You don't even need to. You just got to study history, and you got more than you can take. Looking at the controversy that happened between these kingdoms. All right, so it goes back and forth, and what we're going to do is I'm going to just try and move forward to the time where Grecian Empire began to fall. What this prophecy does is it shows the fall of Persian kingdom, rise and fall of Greece, and then goes into the rise of Rome and its fall. Okay, and we're just going to sort of move forward to the rise of the Caesars. Now, what happened is at the end of the Grecian Empire's sort of end, let me see if we get it up here. Sorry. Okay, verse 14. Now, just toward the end of that section, but toward the end when Greece is about to fall. Now it says, "In those times shall many stand up against the king of the south, also the robbers of thy people shall exalt themselves to establish the vision, but they shall fall." Now, question is, who is these robbers of the people? Now, to give you the understanding here, the king of the south was this Ptolemy. He was only 5 years old. His father died, and he was 5 years old to start his rule. So what happened is Egypt gave guardianship over him, guardianship for people in the government to be able to rule the affairs of Egypt. Now, what happened is Antiochus the Great in the north, he saw this as an opportune time to go in and defeat Egypt. Why not? You've got a 5-year-old king, right? This is perfect time now to extinguish and to overtake this territory that had been fighting over it for so long. And this Antiochus made a treaty with Philip V of Macedonia to go in together, and they would split Egypt between themselves. Now, around this time, while all these civil wars are happening within the Grecian Empire, you've got these little people over toward the west who were a small people to start out with, and they begin to grow and become a strong people. Who was that people? Rome. Rome started off as only a little city, right? Only a few people, just a little village, actually. The name Rome was named after the person who founded it. And it talks about them as robbers, or the actual margin says children of robbers. The reason why it says that, because the people who began Rome or started that village, they were actually robbers. One of the first acts that they did is they went to the neighbouring villages because they didn't have many women in their own tribe. So they went to the neighbouring tribe or village and stole their wives and forced them to be their wives. And so this term, robbers of the people, began. And actually, as you see their diplomatic ways of doing things, they really were robbers. And so what happened is in this vision, you see here, Antiochus is wanting to charge at Egypt. Now, Egypt is getting worried. So they sent, and other countries around it, so they asked for help for Rome. Rome is starting to become a power now. And they asked for Rome to help them against Syria, against Antiochus. And Rome begins bit by bit to exercise its muscle. Right? This is the beginning of it. All right, just read this. A new power is now introduced. The robbers of thy people, literally, says Bishop Newton, the breakers of thy people, far away on the banks of Tiber, a kingdom had been nourishing itself with ambitious projects and dark designs. Small and weak at first, it grew with marvelous rapidity in strength and vigor, reaching out cautiously here and there to try its prowess and test the vigor of its warlike arm, till conscious of its power, it boldly reared its head among the nations of the earth, and seized with invincible hand the helms of their affairs. Okay. And so this little power begins to rise. And it talks about that this power, the fact that Daniel marks this power rising up, the angel tells him that this power is going to establish the vision. In other words, this power makes everything afterward that we read about, it's going to make it sure, right? Once this power starts to rise up. So now we see that the vision transitions from Persia, it goes to Greece, it's Wharf, and now it transitions to Rome. Now, from verse 15 to 22, Rome is the focus of the prophecy. Rome becomes the focus of the prophecy. Okay. Verse 15 says that, "So the king of the north shall come and cast up a mount and take the most fenced cities, and the arms of the south shall not withstand, neither his chosen people, neither shall there be any strength to withstand." This is when we're talking about this 5-year-old Egyptian ruler is ruling, Ptolemy, this young one. Now, they asked some of these other countries near Egypt, they asked Rome's help. Rome said, okay, let's look at it. They try and send some ambassadors. And actually, Philip V, the king of Macedonia, he wouldn't have anything to do with Rome, anything to come to a treaty. So Rome entered into war with him and destroyed him. But what happened with Antiochus, they didn't really touch him. So Antiochus, who was this king of the north, he began to overtake a lot of cities in that time frame, to the point where he was even going up toward Macedonia and Greece, which was a threat to Rome. Rome didn't see Antiochus too much of a threat as long as he stayed there in the east. If he stayed put there, he wasn't too bad. But the moment he began to go toward the west, toward where they were, the line was drawn. And so then Rome began to start exercising some power. Okay, verse 16. "But he that cometh against him shall do according to his own will, and none shall stand before him, and he shall stand in the glorious land which by his hand shall be consumed." All right, what you see is the king of the south couldn't do much against Antiochus. He was weak. Egypt was kind of imploding at that time. It was tumultuous. Nothing was working. So to stand against Antiochus was impossible. Antiochus was going to wipe them out unless Rome would intervene. Now, what you begin to find here, it says, "He that cometh against him shall do according to his own will, and none shall stand before him, and he shall stand in the glorious land which by his hand shall be consumed." Here we have a point where we're going to focus here on this power who's going to come against him and do according to his own will was the power of Rome. Right? There was a point where, like I said, when Antiochus began to go west toward Greece, enough was enough. And so Rome began to intervene. And it talks about that they would stand in the glorious land. What happened in this whole process is the Jews made a league with Rome. They saw Rome as a as a very strong power. And so Jews had appreciated the Greeks because the Greeks allowed them to freely live. And they weren't sure about the Romans. But once the Romans began to become more prominent, they made a league. Now this league is read in the First Maccabees, which we can read as a historical reference here in chapter 8, verse 17 to 32. Just to give, and this happened in 161 BC. In consideration of these things, Judas chose Eupolemus, the son of John, the son of Achos, and Jason, the son of Eleazar, and sent them to Rome to make a league of amity and confederacy with them, and to entreat them that they would take the yoke from them, for they saw that the kingdom of the Grecians did oppress Israel with servitude. They went therefore to Rome, which was a very great journey, and came into the Senate, where they spake and said, Judas Maccabeus with his brethren and the people of the Jews have sent us unto you to make a confederacy and peace with you, that we might be registered your confederates and friends. This is the Jews. So that the matter pleased the Romans well. And this is the copy of the epistle which the Senate, so the Roman Senate, wrote back again in tables of brass and sent to Jerusalem, that there they might have by them a memorial of peace and confederacy. Good success be to the Romans and to the people of the Jews, by sea and by land forever. The sword also, an enemy, be far from them. If there come first any war upon the Romans or any of their confederates throughout all their dominion, the people of the Jews shall help them, as the time shall be appointed, with all their heart. Neither shall they give anything unto them that make war upon them, or aid them with victuals, weapons, money, or ships, as it hath seemed good unto the Romans. But they shall keep their covenants without taking anything therefore. In the same manner also, if war come first upon the nation of the Jews, the Romans shall help them with all their heart, according as the time shall be appointed them. All right, and it goes so on. Here we find in 161, and this is an important date, we'll find out later on. 161 BC, the Jews made a league, and this was probably one of the worst mistakes the Jewish people ever made. Although it seemed good at first, because it seemed like they would be protected against other powers, at the end, Rome crushed the Jews in their iron grasp. And so the treaty actually proved to be tragic for the Jews. Okay. Verse 17, he shall also set his face to enter with the strength of his whole kingdom, and upright ones with him, thus shall he do. He shall give him the daughter of women, corrupting her, but she shall not stand on his side, neither be for him. Now what happens? He spent the winter there, and then he went back. Eventually he went back to Rome. Let me see here. Okay. Oops, sorry. All right, now it says that he shall give him the daughter of women, corrupting her. Or actually what he did is Julius Caesar, with his relationship with Cleopatra, in the sense of corrupting her, he had a child by her. It is written. But the prophet says that she would not stand on his side, neither be for him. And we'll sort of see this as we come out a bit further on. Just so talking here, Caesar and Cleopatra became lovers and spent the winter besieged in Alexandria. Roman enforcements arrived the following spring, and Ptolemy the 13th fled and drowned in the Nile. Cleopatra, now married to the brother of Ptolemy, the 14th, was restored to her throne. In June 47 BC, she gave birth to Ptolemy Caesar, known to the people of Alexandria as Caesarion, or Little Caesar. And so historians aren't sure, but they do assume that this could have been the son of Julius Caesar with Cleopatra. All right? It wouldn't be a far-fetched thought. Okay. Now in the following verses, in verse 17 of Daniel, Let me just get it up here, because I don't think I have it there. In verse 17 of Daniel, talks about this king, or Julius Caesar, that he would set his face and to enter with the strength of his whole kingdom, and upright ones with him, and he shall give him the daughter of women, and so on. Verse 18, then after this he shall turn his faces to the isles, and shall take many. But a prince for his own behalf shall cause the reproach offered by him to cease, and so on. After this relationship, Caesar began to conquer a lot of the isles, or going toward Greece, some of the territory there. And actually, one of those experiences there is where we find the famous saying in 47 BC, when he fought a local war in northeastern Anatolia. And it says there, Caesar's famous words were spoken there. Vene, vidi, vici. I came, I saw, I conquered, were his own account of this campaign afterwards. He came, he saw, and he conquered. But not long after this, not long after this, he returned. In verse 19, it said that he would go back home. It says, afterwards he would return to his face toward the fort of his own land, being Rome, after these battles and conquering. But the verse says that he will stumble and fall and not be found. To stumble and fall is like an unexpected thing. Once Julius Caesar went back to Rome, the Senate, people in the Senate of his own people, murdered him in the actual Senate house. They stabbed him to death. And so, what did he really conquer? What did he really conquer? His own people betrayed him. And now in verse 20, it says, after him then shall stand up in his estate a raiser of taxes in the glory of the kingdom. So at the height and the peak of the Roman kingdom, after Julius Caesar was Augustus Caesar, and he was very famous for his economical reforms in the Roman Empire. He really prospered the Roman Empire. And actually, the Bible actually makes reference to him in this. In Luke chapter 2, verses 1 to 3, now we have Augustus becomes in a time when Jesus was born. It came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. And this taxing was first made with Cyrenius, was governor of Syria, and all went to be taxed, everyone to his own city. This was actually very crucial in the prophecy of Jesus being born in Bethlehem, because they had to all go back to their hometown. Joseph and Mary were in Nazareth, but they had to go, actually they were in Egypt, but they had to go straight back to Bethlehem, all right, for this taxation. And so he was known, this Augustus Caesar, to be very, and he had a peaceful reign. The prophecy says that he would die not in anger, nor would he die in battle. Augustus Caesar died peacefully. He actually had a very peaceful reign. And out of all the Caesars, he was probably the most, probably the better character of them all. Still, I think he had some things that I wouldn't appreciate, but he had a peaceful reign. Now, it's interesting, these prophecies, they're going to come up until a certain point. In his estate, after Augustus, would stand up a vile person, to whom they shall not give the honour of the kingdom, but he shall come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. This next Caesar was Tiberius. And even historians can't describe fully the things that he did. That so vile was he, and so disgusting was his thoughts and his actions, that they give a little bit of a glimpse, but they can't even say it in description. And so you see how the prophecy just follows along, right? I'm reading from the Bible, but history tells me that after Augustus became a vile man. Like I said, I've got my research that you can read there. You just have to go to Encyclopedia Britannica and you see that he's a vile man. Even secular people recognize that. And so you see how we follow the prophecy step by step. Now, Daniel was written, we're talking here, 400 BC, hundreds of years before these things ever happened. This is to show us that the Bible stands strong, that it is true, it is faithful, especially any skeptic, right? And actually, this Tiberius Caesar was there at the time of the ministry of Christ, right? From the time of his baptism and his death. It says, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea, and Herod being tetrarch of Galilee, and his brother Philip tetrarch of Iturea, and of the region of Trachonitis, and Lysanias the tetrarch of Abilene. It's interesting to know, I just found it interesting that at the time of Christ and at the time of his crucifixion, you had the most vile king existing in Rome as opposed to the Lamb of God, who was to be the King of Kings. The two characters living at the same time in this world's history. The most vile and the most beautiful. And who would last in their reign as king? What shows the enduring foundation of a kingdom? All right? Okay. Where are we up to? Now, in that verse 22, about this Tiberius, it says, with arms of a flood shall be overflown from before him. This Tiberius was vulgar, and he ended up going into a coma. I don't know if it was from drinking or... He went into a coma, but they thought he was dead. And as they were carrying him, this is a number of days after, he woke up out of this coma. This is when they were thinking that he was dead. He sat up and he asked the people, I think he asked for a drink of water or something. It was bizarre experience. Totally bizarre. Anyway, one of the officials the next morning came to him and suffocated him with the pillows. And he died. He died tragically like that. A vile man died vilely. And that the verse says that he would be cut off, that he would be broken, but it says at the same time, the Prince of the Covenant would be broken. The Prince of the Covenant is none other than Jesus Christ. They were living at the same time. Tiberius Caesar died about 6 or 7 years after Christ. And I think in 37, I think, AD. Okay. What I want you to appreciate here is you're seeing this rise and fall, disgusting characters coming out in the rule of these nations. And all along, it's noticed the angel shows Daniel that while all these things are happening, there is this lamb that comes in. And the angel shows Daniel, he makes note of this Prince of the Covenant being broken or being sacrificed for the sins of the world. It can't be passed by. It should be noted, even in the prophecy here. Even though it's talking about nations, this Prince of the Covenant dying for the sins of the world should not be overpassed. And all this was being done as he was preparing for the rule of his kingdom. Right? The sacrifice of Jesus was preparing for the establishment of his eternal kingdom. And all was being done, right? While these nations are striving for temporal rule. The Messiah comes in, lives and dies, right? He's resurrected and is going to continue the establishment of his kingdom while these others are going up and down, right? Okay. Now, after this point, I hope you can just bear with me here. I'm trying to run through this as brief as I can with giving it as much justice as I can. After this point, Roman Empire begins to disintegrate. Well, I should say, the verse is going to lead into this. Now, verse 23 of Daniel, it reads that after the league is made with him, he shall work deceitfully and shall come up and shall become strong with a small people. The prophecy hits the peak of Messiah in the middle of Daniel 11, and then the prophecy goes back in time. The reason why we say it goes back in time, and that's not after, is because there was no leagues in these Caesars that were made in history. The only league that was made was the one we read about before with the Jews. Now the prophecy goes back to that point, and now it's going to start another thread that goes all the way to the end, to the second coming. And it talks about that these people would start off as a small people. This was again talking about Rome, the robbers of the people. They started out small and became massive, right? A power to be reckoned with. Now, that power we read about before of Tiberius Caesar was to be broken. Christ's kingdom that he will set up will never be broken. He says, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight, that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now is my kingdom not from hence." Christ was setting up a spiritual kingdom, while all these others are trying to control the territories of earth. James 2:5 says, "Hearken, my beloved brethren, hath not God chosen the poor of this world, rich in faith, and heirs of the kingdom which he has promised to them that love him?" The ones who will gain the kingdom are not those who gain it by conquest. They are the ones who gain it who are rich in faith. The poor in this world who are rich in faith. Right? They're the ones who make a covenant with God by sacrifice, as he made a sacrifice for them. All right, now, and makes note of this league, again, this league, because it talks about that he shall work, verse 24, shall enter peaceably even upon the fattest places of the province, and he shall do that which his fathers have not done, nor his fathers' fathers. He shall scatter them among the prey, spoil and riches, yea, and he shall forecast his devices against strongholds even for a time. Now this is important, it says even for a time. In verse 24, even for a time. Now, Rome was different. He was not like his fathers, nor like his fathers' fathers. Rome was different to Greece, and it was different to Persia. It possessed kingdoms not always by conquest or by war. It possessed sometimes by legacy. Nations would leave their kingdom to Rome. Its diplomacy was quite unique. It would gain territory through diplomacy. What Rome would do is, there was weak countries like we saw before. They would go to them and say, "Look, we'll go in for you and protect you." And it made them seem like Rome was going to protect them and give them independence, but then eventually Rome would take over. And Rome wouldn't do anything, wouldn't take over a country unless it seemed like to the world that the other nation was at fault. So the other world thought that the other nation was at fault, and then they went in. Does it remind you of a nation today that does something similar? Rome at the time was the international referee. What power today is the international referee? United States. Follows very much the same pattern as Rome, as the Republic of Rome. Very much the same pattern. As you read history, I'm astounded to see how very similar it is. Just here, Roman diplomacy. It says one of the Rome's goals was expansion. Sometimes regions were annexed into the Roman state through conquest or negotiation. Primarily through Roman foreign relations, focused on making nations feel they owed loyalty to Rome without taking away their independence. Rome's main contribution to diplomacy was the establishment of a law of nations, or a set of rules for international relations that covered such matters as the proper methods of declaring war and negotiating peace. They were becoming the international referee. Right? Although Romans were not concerned about preserving the equality or rights of other states, they were concerned with the religious implications of starting a war. They did not want to appear to be the aggressor, so they made sure their foreign relations were executed in what they judged to be the correct legal way. Always making it to appear that they had the right to do what they were going to do, to conquer, if they were to take a nation like that. It was by peaceably, right? They were always supposed to be in the right to do it, what they did. And it talks about that he would cast devices for a time. Now, for those who are here, I'm not going to go into it, but the prophetic interpretation for a time is a year. A time is a year, a Jewish year of 360 days. Prophetically, that's 360 years, a day for a year prophecy. I haven't got that here, but that was explained yesterday. Now, he's going to forecast these devices, for a time. When does the time begin? The 360 years. The next verse tells us in verse 25. Okay, time there equals 360 prophetic years. Okay, he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army, and the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army, and he shall not stand, for they shall forecast devices against him. This is where we're going to find the point to when to start the 360 years. Now, what's happening here is after Julius Caesar died, another power came to rule. There was Augustus, but Augustus was only a young man when he began to rule. In place of him was Mark Antony, was the one that was really seen to be the leader of Rome as Augustus was growing up. Now, Mark Antony fell into the same trap as Julius Caesar and became infatuated with Cleopatra. And they began to have their relationship, and to such a point that Rome wasn't happy, and now Rome was actually going to go against Mark Antony and Cleopatra. They created an alliance together, and so obviously Mark Antony had so much soldiers with him that were loyal to him, combined with Cleopatra or the Egyptian army, and they set up for battle. Now it says here that the king of the south would have a great army. He shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south, with a great army. That's the king of the north. King of the north has a great army, and it says that the king of the south has a very great and mighty army. And actually was the case in the time of Mark Antony with his battle with Augustus Caesar. Mark Antony and Cleopatra had, they reckon, about double the ships of what Rome had, and massive ships, bigger than what Rome had. Ships that were supposed to actually rage into other ships and knock them, destroy them. Plus, they reckon that they had almost about 200,000 men as opposed to Rome's 80,000. Right? It was quite a difference. What happened is a lot of the army of Egypt and Mark Antony got actually contracted. They were in an area, in a swampy area, and mosquitoes were there. And a lot of these soldiers contracted malaria, and a lot of the army was disfigured just because of mosquitoes. And then Rome began, and in the whole thing, they realized that they were losing Cleopatra, and so Cleopatra ran away. Mark Antony saw Cleopatra run, and then he went. And that was it. Rome won that battle. That was the battle. I think I got it here. Here we go. At the Battle of Actium between Mark Antony and Augustus Caesar. And the story goes that Mark Antony committed suicide with the thought, where he was, and he wanted his body to be carried to Cleopatra, and the legend goes that Cleopatra put her hand in a jar with a snake, because that was the royal way of dying instead of being killed by the enemy. And so there goes that story, right? These two figures. And so that was the time now that Rome became full conqueror of Egypt. And it talks about them feeding upon the portion of his meat and to destroy him. before Mark Antony died, before this battle, they were trying to make an agreement. Augustus let Mark Antony marry his daughter, I think, or his sister, and then they divorced, and it just never worked. So they'll seem to be at one table, as it says here. They'll speak lies at one table, but it won't prosper. Their treaties didn't prosper. They went to war eventually, and then it says, "For yet the end shall be at the time appointed." Do you have the date here? Okay, just to look at this. Now that date where Mark Antony and lost the battle there was the point where we start the prophecy. That was in 31 BC. 31 BC, and that's when we have the prophetic time. It says, even for a time he will forecast devices, talking about the power of Rome. For 360 years, now we have the start date, 31 BC, from that war. And where does that take you? 31 BC, adding 360 years, takes you to 330 AD. 330 AD is when Constantine moved the capital of Rome, or the capital of the Roman Empire, from Rome to Constantinople. And that's a marked figure of when the Roman Empire began to fall. When Constantine did that, the Roman Empire began to fall, right? Especially more markedly. It's interesting, isn't it? All these things. The Bible exactly from 31, it gives you a date of something significant, not just an airy-fairy date, but something actually happened that the Rome was going to forecast devices only for a time, right? Up until that time, then it began to disintegrate. All right, then shall he return to his land with great riches, and his heart shall be against the holy covenant, and he shall do exploits and return to his land. Now this vision begins to move forward into time against a person who was going to set his heart against the holy covenant, in other words, against Jerusalem. And so there was a time when the Romans fully destroyed Jerusalem, right? The Jewish-Roman wars in 66 to 73 AD. And that's when you see Jerusalem destroyed in 70 AD, right? Only for a time. The league that Jews made with the Romans was fatal to them. And it says, at the time appointed he shall return and come toward the south, but it shall not be as the former or as the latter. It should not be as the former nor as the latter. The appointed time spoken of before in verse 24 was 330 AD. And so there was going to come a time when they weren't going to have the same strength. It says here, Rome then lost its prestige. The Western division was exposed to the incursions of foreign enemies by the time it came to Constantine and after him. On the death of Constantine, the Roman Empire was divided into three parts between his three sons, Constantius, Constantine II, and Constans. Constantine II and Constans quarrelled, and Constans, being victor, gained the supremacy of the whole West. He was soon slain by one of his commanders, who in turn was shortly after defeated by the surviving emperor, and in despair ended his own days in AD 353. The barbarians of the north now began their incursions and extended their conquest till the imperial power of the West expired in 476 AD. And you had these barbarian tribes, especially the Germanic tribes, now coming in, right? And they're going to plunder Western Rome, right? And really split it up. Whoops. All right, and this is where you find now the fall, again, fall of papal Rome, Roman Empire, Imperial Rome, and the rise of papal Rome. And maybe I won't go too much into this, but it talks about that they would have indignation. In verse 30, so at the time appointed, verse 30, the ships of Shittim shall come against them, and therefore he shall be grieved and return and have indignation against the holy covenant. So shall he do, he shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. That is the Holy Scriptures, this indignation that was seen in that time. There was, as the Pope began to rise up into power, there was the hiding away of the Bible of truth, right, suppressing it, and in place substituting it, especially in the time of Constantine, true worship, true Christian worship, and mingling it with pagan worship. Here you see a revolution of this nature was accomplished in Rome. The Heruli, Goths and Vandals who conquered Rome embraced the Arian faith and became enemies of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church was divided at that time. You had Arians and you had Catholics, which I'm not going to go into, but it was a theological debate about the nature of Christ. It was and it split the whole empire into two. The whole empire. Now these groups, Heruli, Goths and Vandals, these barbarian tribes, they were the Arian faith. And so they were bitter enemies. It says it was especially for the purpose of exterminating these heresy that Justinian decreed the Pope to be the head of the church and the corrector of heretics. The Bible soon came to be regarded as a dangerous book that should not be read by the common people, but all questions in dispute were to be submitted to the Pope. Thus was indignity heaped upon God's word. And the emperors of Rome and the Eastern division of which still continued had intelligence and connived with the Church of Rome, which had forsaken the covenant and constituted the great apostasy for the purpose of putting down heresy, so-called. The man of sin was raised to his presumptuous throne by the defeat of the Arian Goths, who then held possession of Rome in AD 538. Is when you see papal Rome or the Pope have full reign, full rule. Regarding this Shittim, there was a time, the Shittim people, or talking about Shittim, it's a part of North Africa in Carthage, ancient Carthage. And from here is when Genseric, these tribes, they sacked Rome. After Rome's capital was moved to Constantinople, they sacked it, right? They were completely against it. And so you have these wars going on between these two faiths, or these two groups. Now, Constantine and Justinian were instrumental in forming the papacy. The reason for that, Constantine was there he was the one that blended the worship, Christian worship, with paganism and the schools of thought back then. And so you have that's where you see, through Constantine, you see the theology and the system being made prominent. Then you have Justinian, who really gave the Pope civil power. Right? He really gave the Pope civil power by that time. Then the Pope became one of the strongest powers in the world, above every other nation, basically. Now, it's important to note this year, 508. It was in 508 that paganism, you saw a marked declension of paganism and uprising of the Catholic faith, of the Popish system. It's a marked manner of 508. Now, the reason why that's important is because when we understand that the time of the end is 1798, which is its own study, I know that I'm taking things for granted here. When you put 1260 days, as comes through in the Bible, in Daniel chapter 12, verse 11, and Daniel 11 itself, it goes from, when you count 1290 days in Daniel chapter 12, backward from 1798, it brings you to the year 508. And that's when the Pope began to rise. It took the Pope 30 years to get full power, to extinguish the three groups of Arians. By 538, he was supreme ruler. It took him 30 years to rise to power, full power. But the Bible marks the two dates, when he began to rise and then when he had full power. The Bible marks the date, 508 till 538. Right, and it marks 538 because the Ostrogoths was the final tribe to be knocked out. Right, and that's when he had full supremacy. And then you have this, I might skip these things, but then you have this persecution. It just goes on to show the substitution, like what Brother Peter brought out yesterday of the worship, and the persecution that would happen, and the faithfulness of a few during that time of papal persecution for 1260 years, from 538 to 1798. The reason why we say 1798 is because that's when the Pope's power was broken, in 1798. Why was it broken in 1798? Because that's when the French Revolution happened, and the general of Napoleon took the Pope hostage, and the Pope died in exile. And the Pope system has never seen the same power as it had before that time. Never has it seen it since that time. All right, let's just go through these, because I want to get toward the end. Now, the prophecy brings you all the way through to 1798 as a marked prophecy. In verse 36, it talks about this king that will do according to his will. And he will exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods. Now, so far, it looks like the Pope, because elsewhere describing the Pope, it describes him the same way. But we'll notice that it's not him. It can't be him, because now it's after 1798, or by the time the Pope's power is broken. He shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished, for that is determined shall be done. Okay. Now, this is just a historical fact here. Pius, on good terms with the Allies against France in 1793, and felt that he could rely on them, but in 1796 his territory was invaded after the last Austrian defeat by Napoleon, who forced the Pope to sign a peace treaty at Tolentino on February 19, 1797. A riot in Rome in the following December led to French occupation of that city on February 15, 1798 of Rome, and the proclamation of a republic by a group of Italian patriots. Aged and frail, he was seized by the French in March 1799, talking about the Pope, and died a prisoner in France the following August. All right? The Pope was broken, the papal system, by the French Revolution. The French Revolution rocked the European world. It rocked it. Okay. So this power that we're looking at in verse 30, in verse 30, this king that does according to his will, is none other than the French power. Okay, just looking at the way that it describes him. Now, this power is going to be a few things marked how it's going to define him. One thing is that this power has to be existing in the commencement of the time of the end. In other words, the power has to be strong around the 1790s. The next one has to be a willful power, and after the third thing, it has to be atheistical. It's an atheistic power. Regards no God at all. The Roman power still regards God. It just substitutes the worship. But this power has no God, it declared. So, in just looking at this, it says, associated with himself with such men as Raciu and others, he undertook the work. They sowed to the wind and reaped the whirlwind. Their efforts culminated in the reign of terror. Sorry, I missed the party. Sorry, let me go back. A revolution exactly answering to this description did take place in France at the time indicated in the prophecy. Voltaire had sowed the seeds which bore their legitimate and baleful fruit. That boastful infidel, in his pompous but impotent self-conceit, had said, I am weary of hearing people repeat that 12 men established the Christian religion. I will prove that one man may suffice to overthrow it. right? And begin to see this outward declaration. And it culminated in what's called the Reign of Terror. You can do your own research on the Reign of Terror. It was disgusting what happened leading up in the revolution. The thousands that were slain on the street, and it was horrible, right? The moment they began to reject God, they became vile. They became, I don't know what to describe. The society just went backward completely. It says here, with blasphemous boldness, almost beyond belief, one of the priests of the new order said, God, if you exist, avenge your injured name. I bid you defiance. You remain silent. You dare not launch your thunders. Who after this will believe in your existence? And what an echo is this of the Pharaoh's demand, who is Jehovah that I should obey his voice? I know not Jehovah. This has a match to Revelation chapter 11, mind you, which also mentions the French Revolution. And it says that they would become like Egypt. That they would be like Egypt, just declaring that there is no God, no Jehovah. And this was a marked thing. Never had a nation civilized, a government rejected God. Never has it happened before, except in the French government. Never has it happened before. Not like that, not so outwardly and boastfully. And it talks about that they would not desire women, have the desire of women. They should not regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any God. And this is how we know that it's not the Pope, because they don't regard any God. For he shall magnify himself above all. And with this no desiring women, it's really the desire of wives. They changed the law of marriage in the French Revolution, so that marriage was just a contract. And so they began to really break down the system of society. And they actually went as far as to one woman, I think an actress here at the bottom. Well, they said it as a mere civil contract. And this Sophie Arnold, an actress famous for the witty things she said, described the Republican marriage as the sacrament of adultery. The sacrament of adultery. They completely just spat on everything that was good and pure and for the upbuilding of society. And it says, in his estate shall he honour the God of forces, and a God whom his fathers knew not shall he honour with gold and silver and precious things. In place, they regarded no God, and then they realised that they have to put something. It's funny, even in their own history, you see it come out. So they get a woman, and they exalt her and call her the God of reason, the goddess of reason. So they said that they worshipped equality, and reason and all these things. And they were very far from it as far as their society was concerned at that time. Very far from it. But that's what they proposed to worship. And yeah, it just goes on through the history. But I won't go through it now, just to tie it up, because I know we've gone quite far. It's a heavy study. I'm trying to go as fast as I can to give it justice. Like I said, you need a week to go through it properly. Okay, and it goes again throughout him. Thus shall he do in most strongholds. And it says that what marks this as France is that he will divide the land for gain. And this is what France did. They began to take the land of the wealthy, they stole it off them and divided it and resold it. And they earned something like 700 million I guess whatever the currency was back then, 700 million. They prospered by doing that to get their funds. Yeah, 700 million sterling at the disposal of the government. They took it off the churches, the clergy, just everything, right? The Pope had such an effect on France that it completely went the opposite way. To resist popery, and went into atheism. And now we come here toward the end. Verse 40, we've only got a few more verses here. Rule of the Turks. It says, at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships, and shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. After the French Revolution, you saw the rise of Napoleon. Napoleon became the first consul of the French monarchy, became a monarchy. And Napoleon didn't want a republic. He felt comfortable with that. And anyway, then began his thirst for power. Now what happened is he desired, let me see here. He desired to take Britain. Napoleon desired to take Britain. It says, only the war at sea against the British continued. The directors who wanted to launch an invasion of the British Isles appointed Bonaparte to command the army assembled for this purpose along the English Channel. After a rapid inspection in February 1798, again the time of the end, these things were going to happen. He announced that the operation could not be undertaken until France had command of the sea. Napoleon said it wasn't a good time. So what happened? He suggested that France strike at the sources of Great Britain's wealth by occupying Egypt and threatening the route to India. Egypt was Britain's route to India, and that's where their wealth was. So Napoleon said, if we get Egypt, we can stop their wealth. This proposal, seconded by Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, the foreign minister, was accepted by the directors, who were glad to get rid of their ambitious young general, this Napoleon. Now, what happened is, in history, is Napoleon began to invade Egypt. And actually, it took Egypt. And so then and when it took Egypt, now what's another thing to keep in mind is by the time we get to 1798, the power that ruled, because we haven't talked about kings of north and south for a while yet, but in the meantime, the Ottoman Empire had become both. It had conquered Egypt and it had conquered Syria and Asia Minor. So the Mohammedans or the Turks had rule of those areas in that time. So when France took Egypt, what did France become? King of the South. And now that's when you have in the Bible reference to now again kings of the South fighting against another king. Well, who was the king of the North? The king of the North was the Ottoman Empire. Right? The Ottoman Empire wasn't happy that France took over Egypt because they saw Egypt as theirs. It says here, but Turkey, nominally suzerain over Egypt, declared war on France in war on France in September to prevent a Turkish invasion of Egypt and also perhaps to attempt a return to France by way of Anatolia. Bonaparte marched into Syria in February 1799. His progress northward was halted at Acre, where the British withstood a siege in May. And in May, Bonaparte began a disastrous retreat to Egypt. So here we begin to see these allies. The Turks were becoming weak. And France was a strong, especially under Napoleon, was a strong army, a strong power to be reckoned with. And so the King of the North's reaction was quite different to Egypt. Had a weak response. They couldn't really go against. They couldn't really go against France, this power that was coming in. Okay. Yeah, at the time of the end, this is verse 40. At the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind. The push at him, the him was France. The king of the south would push at him, but it couldn't stand. But the king of the north would come in like a whirlwind. Why? The Turks came in. As Napoleon went up to Syria, going up toward them, Britain came by with their naval fleets and destroyed Napoleon's army, so much so that they had to retreat back to Egypt, okay, pushing back. So the Turks now are only strong as far as their allies are concerned. And it talks about that he would enter the glorious land and many countries shall be overthrown. What happened is when the Turks pushed back France with the help of Britain, they took over many countries that were re-established many things there, except for a few, which the Bible talks about Edom, Moab, and Ammon. They were the Arab tribes, basically Saudi Arabia, the area of Saudi Arabia, they were out of the route. And so when Ottomans pushed back France, they didn't take any of that area. They kept around Palestine and sort of re-established that. Now, verse 42 says, "He shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape." Talking about the rule or that grab of Ottoman Empire would not escape. Egypt preferred to have France actually as a ruler. Ottomans were oppressive, but they could not escape out of the hand of Egypt, just verse 42 to give clarity there. Verse 43, "He shall have power over the treasures of gold and of silver and over all the precious things of Egypt. And the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps." Now what's interesting is some refer this to the Ottomans, but also you can find here an application or fulfillment in Great Britain. Because Great Britain was beginning to speak through the Turks. They had the arm of strength to speak through them. The Turks were becoming the weak man of the East. So if it didn't have Europe's help, like France, sorry, that was later on France, but Britain's help and Russia or Prussia, they didn't stand a chance. So Britain begins to exert its power, and especially it began to rule in Egypt, had more dominion in Egypt as well. And what do you have in Egypt? It began to rule, where it says here, "And the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps." And so this can be applicable to even Great Britain. They were at his steps as far as his rule. And Great Britain ruled for some time in Egypt, right? In the 1800s. Okay. Now just a few references. In 1840, England, Russia, Austria, Prussia decided to interpose to settle the differences between the Sultan and Muhammad, which was the ruler of Egypt at that time. And this is where you begin to see the fall of the Ottoman Empire. They become weak, they lean on European power, right, to divide. And this is where you see Britain then have more hold of Egypt. All right, they came in to settle the differences. And so it was at that time that England began to have a stronger power over Syria and Turkey. And he was thus exercising power of the north as well. And then England obtained direct control of Egypt between 1882 and 1922. Right? They had dominion over Egypt. Now you get to the part, verses 44 and 45. You see how some of this history is becoming close to some people here, right? As far as not that long ago. 44 and 45, it says, "Now, we come to a point now where Daniel 11 has brought us to the modern times. We've seen Persia, we've seen Greece, we've seen Imperial Rome, we've seen Papal Rome, we've seen the Mohammedans under Turkey's Ottoman Empire, we've seen France under Napoleon's rule, and we've seen the rule of Great Britain. All these nations clamouring their part, what their part's going to be as far as the last struggle in this world's history. And as far as we see today, the king of the north today, as we understand it, whoever occupies that territory, Well, today that stands as Turkey, modern-day Turkey, the government of Turkey. Today is the King of the North to still fulfill this. Now, what's important is, remember, it's not the king, it's whoever possesses the territory. So that can change in the future, and it probably will. In the future, it will probably be that powers will come to aid or speak or go through Turkey, and that will become the power of the King of the North. But it's understand that whoever controls that area is the subject of the prophecy. And these prophecies, verse 44 and 45, are still to be fulfilled. They haven't been fulfilled yet. We've gone through all of Daniel 11, all that's been fulfilled in history. And now we're on the verge of this world's history. So it's tidings of the east and out of the north shall trouble him. Therefore shall he go forth with great fury to destroy and to utterly make away many. Some apply this to the Crimean War, where you had Russia and Iran as allies against Turkey, right? Turkey wanting to manifest its authority against Russia. Russia was a threat. Even till today, all you have to do is go on Google and look at the news. You just type in Turkey, Russia, Iran. Even as short as a week, just a week ago, they were having meetings together to try and settle, because Russia and Iran are allies, but Turkey are opposed to them. All right? And they're trying to come together because of this issue in Syria. And so this issue in Syria is a big thing, and they wanted to know what should be the role of the United States, and because they're not so happy, and all these things, right? All of them wanting to fight for help. But either way, something's going to trouble, whatever power, it's going to trouble the King of the North. A power is going to possess modern-day Turkey, whether it be Turkey itself or that territory, and it's going to be, the only thing that's north is probably Russia or Europe, and the only thing that's east would be Iran or further east, China. And so what we expect in the future is that a power from the east, either Iran or China or somewhere there, is going to trouble the area of Turkey, the power that occupies Turkey, and either Europe or Russia is going to trouble them. This is what we're looking for when we watch the news. And it talks about this power. He will plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain. Yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. Something's going to happen, that the power of Turkey, or the Turks are going to move out of Turkey, and they're going to move down toward Palestine, toward Jerusalem, because that's the holy mountain. All right. According to Daniel himself, it says, Jerusalem, thy holy mountain. Jerusalem is thy holy mountain, just to clarify for you. Turks are going to move southward somewhere. Something's going to happen that makes them, was going to force them to go south into Jerusalem and make that their capital. It says he will plant the tabernacles there, and after that time, yet he shall come to his end. Something's going to happen. He's going to come to his end, and none will help him. It goes to show that prior to that, he's had help. Prior to that, he has had help, because when the time comes and he has no one to help him, he's finished. The power finishes. Now, there's a lot involved in these verses than what we just read. You have to combine Revelation. You have to combine even Old Testament prophecies. Just to conclude, though, the events connected with these last scenes of Daniel 11, what we're still awaiting, is that there's going to be a false religious awakening, which is just prior to Armageddon. We are approaching in Daniel 11 Armageddon. Now, to a lot of people, it's an eerie word, but it will happen. All nations will flow to Jerusalem. All nations. So you're going to have one, there's going to be a power that's going to rise out there, and it won't be just a civil power, there's going to be a religious power there. And most likely it will be the Pope, it will be papacy somehow moving a seat there. There has to be something there because all nations, according to Isaiah, are going to move to Jerusalem. They're going to flow there, right? Meaning the leaders. According to Isaiah chapter 2, Micah chapter 4, and Joel chapter 3. And in that time, that's just prior to Armageddon. There's going to be a church-state government in Jerusalem. And this will be regarded as the highest power on earth and having like the religion. And all this apparent peace, it's going to look peaceful, like a good thing. But as soon as there is peace, Apostle Paul says, when they say peace, watch out, sudden destruction approaches. Okay? When they shall say peace and safety, then sudden destruction comes. And all that culminates to the real king. All these nations, back and forth. I mean, I've just been here for nearly 2 hours, and I'm sorry it's taken this long. I hope you can appreciate just the magnitude of the study. I hope it's been interesting so it hasn't been boring for you. But just going through this history. Then we approach the real king. There's kings of north, there's kings of south, but they're all going to lay in the dust. The real king, as soon as you go into chapter 12 is a continuation of the prophecy. Daniel then sees Michael stand up. And the moment Michael stands up is when probation finishes for this world. Michael is the archangel, according to Jude. Just understand that this is Christ. And Thessalonians says that the Lord himself shall descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trump of God, and the dead in Christ shall rise. John chapter 5 says that when he comes again, that the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God. So the voice of the archangel is in fact the voice of the Son of God. That means that Michael the archangel is Jesus Christ himself. He is the chief above all angels. He is the chief in command of the heavenly host. And his kingdom and his dominion will have no end. When you read the book of Daniel, especially chapters 4 and 5, when you read about Nebuchadnezzar's experience, the main point that as I read that, the angel keeps wanting to enforce that Nebuchadnezzar would know and that we would know that it is God who is the Most High who rules in the kingdom of men, not men. Men will try to gain territory, but they won't have a chance. It will not last. God's purpose will prevail. God's purpose will prevail. Not France, not Great Britain, not Turks, not the Pope. God's purpose will prevail. And I want to be on his side. Right? No other side will prevail except his. None other. Right? All these kingdoms, we've seen Babylon as a lion, right? As a ferocious beast. You see Medo-Persia as a bear, right? Greece as a leopard, and Rome as an unexplainable beast. And yet the lamb, Christ's kingdom is represented by a lamb. Do you see the contrast? You got all these beasts, and then you got the lamb. And it's the lamb's kingdom who's going to overrule all these. The lamb. Revelation 17:14 says, "These shall make war with the lamb, and the lamb shall overcome them. For he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and they that are with him are called and chosen and faithful." He, the Lamb, is the King of kings and Lord of lords. Is he your King of kings? Right? The only people, the only surety of our eternal life is having him as King of your life and as Lord of your life. He's my King and he's my Lord. Right? Isaiah 43:50 says, "I am the Lord, your Holy One, the Creator of Israel, your King." God is seeking to be your King, for you to acknowledge him as your King. Christ is going to set up an everlasting kingdom. He's setting up an everlasting kingdom, and he wants us to know that the Most High rules. You know, in Nebuchadnezzar's experience, just these last few verses here, Daniel chapter 4, it's interesting. Nebuchadnezzar's experience is amazing to me. I'm always amazed when I read it. This heathen king was converted, and I believe he will be saved in the kingdom. I have no doubt about it because of his experience. In the end of after God gave him the experience for him to realize that who is the King of Kings, that the Lamb is going to be the ruler over all things. He says these words. He says, "And at the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up mine eyes unto heaven, and mine understanding returned unto me, and I blessed the Most High. And I praised and honoured him that lives forever, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion." Even he recognized that he doesn't have. Babylon will not exist forever. Persia will not exist forever. Greece won't exist forever. Rome won't exist forever. France won't exist forever. Australia won't exist forever. God's kingdom is an everlasting dominion. And his kingdom is from generation to generation. And all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. All these men that appear to be great throughout history are reputed as nothing. All their vainness, their vain glory, their apparent greatness, Alexander the Great, Cyrus the Great, where are they? And where will they be in eternity? Their names will not be remembered in eternity. Only those who are faithful, only the poor in this world who are rich in faith will be remembered in eternity. They will be great. It says, "He doeth according to his will in the army of heaven." God does according to his will. He overrules on all these things. Everything will bring about his purpose. Nothing happens without his consent. And it says, "None can stay his hand or say unto him, What doest thou?" There's an important lesson that Nebuchadnezzar learnt, and that all of us will need to learn in order to be a part of that everlasting kingdom. We need to learn the lesson of Matthew 21:44, that whosoever shall fall on this stone shall be broken, but on whomsoever it shall fall, it will grind him to powder. In the dream of Daniel chapter 2, Daniel saw a stone cut out without hands representing God's kingdom, and it struck the statue at its feet where we live today, and the whole thing was obliterated into powder. Christ is speaking to us that the only way we can be prepared for such a kingdom is to be broken on him, to experience sorrow for sin, repentance, acknowledge him as the one who's crucified for. The prophecy in Daniel, I can't believe that out of it all, in the middle of it is the crucifixion. And at the end of it is his second coming. The Lamb will rule. And he's seeking for us to acknowledge that he has died. He is the uplifted Saviour of the world. And he wants us to fall on him and be broken. Right? These kings weren't broken. They were full of pride, full of arrogancy. And we are too if we aren't broken. Do you understand? We are too if we're not broken. We will have the same fate of these kings if we don't fall upon the rock and become broken. Nebuchadnezzar praised God specifically for one thing. He said that he praises and extols and honors the King of heaven. All his works are truth and his ways judgment. And the thing that Nebuchadnezzar saw remarkable about Jehovah was that those that walk in pride, he is able to abase. That God is able to put the pride of man in the dust without destroying him. Without destroying him. No God, no person can do that. No person can destroy pride without destroying the worth of a person. Except Jehovah. And Job, just as our last verse here. God was asking Job questions. And I love these. I love reading this because it says a lot. It says, "Gird up thy loins now like a man." This is God talking to Job. "I will demand of thee and declare thou unto me. Wilt thou also disannul my judgment? Will you condemn me that thou mayest be righteous? Hast thou an arm like God? Or canst thou not thunder with a voice like him? So God is asking these questions to Job to see if he can answer them. Right? And the obvious answer is no. Right? Just look at these questions though. Deck thyself now with majesty and excellency, and array thyself with glory and beauty. Not the vain glory that these kings did, talking about the beauty of character. The beauty of a character, of a virtuous life. Cast abroad. These men couldn't even control themselves as far as their ambition and their rage and their passions. He said, cast abroad the rage of thy wrath, and behold everyone that is proud, and abase him. He's asking Job, do these things. Can you do these things? Can you cast abroad the rage of thy wrath? Can you see that someone is proud and bring them low, abase them? Look on everyone that is proud and bring him low, and tread down the wicked in their place, and hide them in the dust together. Bind their faces in secret, and bind their faces in secret. Then God says a remarkable statement. God is asking Job, if you can do all these things, then will I also confess unto thee that thine own right hand can save you. If you can get rid of your passion and your sins, if you can get rid of your pride, then I will tell you that your own right hand can save you. The answer is no. Our own right hand can't save us. It needs an omnipotent God to bring low, to be broken, and to destroy the sin that exists in us and make us ready for when Michael stands up. And so I pray that this study will provoke you to get ready. There's only 2 more verses before Michael stands up. 2 more verses. The Bible says that the time of the end is 1798. We're how many hundred years now past that? A couple hundred years. Christ will stand up. And what makes us know that he will stand up is because everything else was fulfilled perfectly. Christ, Michael, will stand up. And the Lamb will reign as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And so I pray that we'll have the experience to be ready for that and be broken on the rock Christ Jesus. Amen.